Okay, so why are information and communication technologies topics that are relevant for arms control and disarmament? Well, first of all, we should recognize how all sectors of society and all social interactions are becoming increasingly digitized. And with this digitalization is becoming increasingly a key enabler for economic and social development on one side, as well as a main driver of innovation in the defense and security field. In practice, this trend has led to the proliferation of connected devices, of networks, of physical and digital infrastructure and services that allow the digital ecosystem to operate and constantly grow. While this has offered undoubtedly multiple benefits for humanity and society as a whole, it has also created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by malicious actors, including states, criminal groups, terrorist organizations, and so-called hacktivists, to achieve different goals than being political, economic, financials, or merely recreational, if you want. So the push towards digitization and the emergence of malicious cyber acts has contributed significantly to blurring the lines between well-established concepts such as peace and conflict, creating a sort of perpetual cyber conflict between those that are trying to compromise information on one side and those that are trying to defend it on the other side. For example, the last decade has seen the proliferation of so-called advanced persistent threats, which are non-opportunistic targeted cyber attacks in which intruders gain access to networks and remain undetected for very long periods of time while pursuing long-term objectives. And this is opposed to more opportunistic behaviors and approaches, for example, used for short-term financial gains or fraud purposes. Now, these malicious activities have proven to be equally effective in both peace and conflict scenarios, and have been used against a very wide range of targets, from individuals to civilian critical infrastructure to organizations and military assets and targets. Now, among the many complexities of the digital domain, three make it particularly challenging from an international security, disarmament, and arms control perspective. First, there is no internationally agreed definition of cyber, and the concept of cyber weapon remains heavily disputed. This, compounded with the challenges highlighted for other types of intangible technologies, those that are not physical material and therefore cannot be seen and controlled and counted and accounted for, makes it even more difficult to design control mechanisms that are centered around specific cyber technologies. Second, attributing malicious cyber acts to a specific perpetrator is a complex, lengthy, and at times inexact effort where technical, legal, and ultimately political considerations have to be taken into account. Last but not least, the digital domain really has no geographical boundaries, and as such, preserving digital peace and security requires a coordinated international response. It is important to note that to date, there are no international treaties or other legally binding instruments on regulating behavior in the cyber domain. That being said, states have agreed that international law applies to cyber as well. And since 2015, the UN General Assembly has adopted a set of 11 voluntary norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Other colleagues now are going to go deeper into the UN and state responses, but it is worth noting also that in addition to state-driven action, it is important to flag that in the digital domain, other forms of voluntary measures or self-regulation initiatives are becoming increasingly common, particularly originating from industry and the private sector, for example, in relation to additional norms, code of conduct, or industry standards. And with that, I give the floor to my next colleague.
So what are the existing frameworks governing ICTs in international security? Well, developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security have been on the formal agenda since late 1998, when General Assembly adopted a resolution expressing concern that ICTs can potentially be used for purposes that are not really consistent with the objectives of maintaining international peace and security. 3 years later, the General Assembly requested the Secretary General to appoint a group of governmental experts, or often referred to as GGE, to examine existing and potential threats in the sphere of information security and to propose possible cooperative measures to address these challenges. The first 15-member GGE was established in 2004. And since then, the General Assembly established 6 GGEs to study possible cooperative measures to address existing and potential threats in the ICT environment. 4 of these groups have agreed on substantive reports and put forward recommendations on norms, rules, and principles for the responsible behavior of states, confidence building measures, capacity building, and on the questions of how international law applies to the use of ICTs by states. In 2018, the relevant institutionalized international efforts doubled. In addition to establishing the 6th GGE, the General Assembly also established an open-ended working group, or referred to as OEWG, on developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security. This so-called OEWG was tasked to further develop the rules, norms, and principles of responsible state behavior in cyberspace and the ways for implementation of the existing rules, norms, and principles. In contrast to the group of governmental experts, or GGEs, the OEWG was open to all UN member states, and through the intersessional consultative meetings, considered also the inputs of the interested non-state actors, such as businesses, non-governmental organizations, academia, and so on, to share their views on the issues within the group's mandate. The group adopted a report by consensus at its final session in March 2021, which was later adopted by the General Assembly. The GGE of the same year, 2018, too culminated in a consensus report, providing an additional layer of understanding to the findings and recommendations of the previous groups of governmental experts. This brings us to today. In 2020, the General Assembly established a new five-year OEWG on security of and in the use of information and communications technologies, with the mandate largely unchanged from the previous OEWG. The group already held 2 substantive sessions, the last one commencing in March 2022.
Following consensus reports and the consensus report of the Open-Ended Working Group 2019-2021, the current Open-Ended Working Group is not starting from scratch, and as you've already heard, is considering the same agenda items. I will outline the current issues under discussion. So under emerging and existing threats, states are concerned with the malicious ICT activities on critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure. These threats include ransomware, but states are also concerned about the development of ICT capabilities for military purposes, and also the impact of new technologies such as artificial intelligence. On norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior, there are 11, including on respect for human rights and privacy, responsible reporting of ICT vulnerabilities, protection of critical infrastructure, and states are also asked to consider all relevant information before attributing a malicious ICT incident. States are discussing how to facilitate and support the implementation of the 11 norms. All member states agree that international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law applies in cyberspace. Of importance under this agenda item is how and states are encouraged to continue to share their national positions on how international law applies. But under this agenda item, the issues around the need for an international convention on cybersecurity are also being discussed. The fourth agenda item is confidence building measures, or CBMs. CBMs are planned procedures to prevent hostilities, to avert escalation, to reduce tensions, and to build mutual trust between countries. States are currently discussing how to implement these CBMs, including on how to share relevant information and lessons, nominate a national point of contact, including at the technical, policy, and diplomatic level, and the modalities for establishing a directory of such points of contact at the global level. States are also exploring mechanisms for regular cross-regional exchanges of lessons and good practices on CBMs, taking into account differences in regional contexts and the structures of relevant organizations. The following point, capacity building. States agree that cyber capacity building should be guided by a number of principles, including that it should be based on mutual trust, be demand-driven, correspond to nationally identified needs and priorities, and be undertaken in full recognition of national ownership. A number of issues are under discussion, including the institutional role of the United Nations in capacity building, as well as the role of non-state stakeholders, including academia, civil society, and industry. On the last point, regular institutional dialogue. The last open-ended working group had a mandate of a year. This one, 5 years. Member states are also exploring a regular, perhaps permanent institution in which to discuss international cybersecurity issues. One of the options on the table is a program of action. It's important to note that all the agenda items mentioned above are interrelated. For instance, states have agreed that for the effective implementation of norms and to be able to articulate their national positions on international law, they may have to undertake other measures, including capacity building. The next substantive session of the open-ended working group will be in July 2022. Thank you.
We've all heard about artificial intelligence in a way or in another, but why should AI become a topic of arms control and disarmament? Well, AI has been widely recognized as one of the most disruptive technologies of our time. Some refer to it as the main driver of the fourth industrial revolution. Others focus on the potential economic impact that AI will have, with some estimates of around $16 trillion by 2030. Now, with an impact of such magnitude, the defense and security sector is no exception. And military forces from all around the world are exploring different ways in which they could integrate this revolutionary technology in their military capabilities, with a view to increase efficiency, effectiveness of their own forces, minimize risks associated with military operations. However, the integration of AI in military systems brings also a new wave of challenges to international security, as it's been indicated by the United Nations Secretary General in his report on current developments in science and technology and their potential impact on international security and disarmament efforts. Now, one of the main challenges when it comes to identifying what are these risks and why is AI important is related to the fact that there is no internationally agreed definition of what artificial intelligence is. So it becomes difficult to assess the magnitude of challenges and risks associated to it. In simple terms, we can refer to artificial intelligence as human intelligence displayed by machines. Now, this is quite a simple definition in terms of the terminology that it uses, but the meaning that it carries is profound. Ultimately, we're looking at machines that could be used to complement, supplement, or substitute human agents in the execution of certain tasks, simple or complex that they might be. Now, if we focus on the security context, AI in simple way can be divided into two categories. AI that can be used to support the decision-making processes and command and control on one hand, and on the other hand, AI as an enabler of autonomy in physical or digital systems. Now, both applications raise different types of concerns. For example, technical concerns related to the reliability, predictability, and explainability of these systems. So the ability to really understand the functioning of these systems and the ways in which they process the information and they reach their final decision that is ultimately going to be executed in the real world. There are legal concerns related to the ability of human decision makers to understand enough of these systems and machines and deploy them in compliance with all applicable legal frameworks, starting but not limited to international law and international humanitarian law. There are ethical questions related to the big concept itself of delegating decisions potentially about the use of force, and so the life or death decisions to non-human agents. And last but not least, there are arms control concerns related to the nature of these technologies that are intangible. It is difficult to design arms control mechanism and tools for lines or millions of lines of code, but also due to the more than dual purpose, I would say all-purpose nature of these technologies. So how can states limit the risks of proliferation and misuse of this technology without hindering innovation and positive effects that this technology can bring? Now, compared to other fields of disarmament and arms control, debates on this topic remain relatively new. However, artificial intelligence is here to stay and will only become increasingly embedded in all sectors of society, defense and military sectors included. Therefore, it is fundamental for states to take a proactive approach to their governance of this transformative technology.
As a disarmament diplomat in Geneva, it is useful to know the existing processes governing AI. AI has a range of military applications, not just in weapon systems, but also command and control, decision support systems, defensive and offensive information and communication technology systems, and military planning and logistics. Now, given the range of military applications of AI, states at the international level have been examining the legal, security, and ethical concerns posed by the integration of AI in military systems, processes, and activities, and exploring options to address them. In the UN, military AI is primarily being discussed in the context of increasing autonomy in weapon systems. The weaponization of artificial intelligence was also examined in the Conference on Disarmament. In 2018, the Conference on Disarmament established 5 subsidiary bodies to start a gradual process encompassing all substantive agenda items, as well as emerging and other issues relevant to the substantive work of the conference. The 5th subsidiary body addressed developments in science and technology, information and communication technologies, and the weaponization of artificial intelligence. In February 2022, the 5 subsidiary bodies were re-established. Subsidiary Body 5, which is related to new types of weapons of mass destruction and new systems of such weapons, radiological weapons, comprehensive program of disarmament, and transparency in armaments, may also consider destabilizing risks posed by emerging technologies, including militarization of AI technologies, as many states have expressed concern on the issue in context of discussions on the subsidiary body. In context of state behavior in cyberspace, member states have expressed concern with emerging technologies, including progress in AI and machine learning, possibly expanding the attack surface, creating new vectors and vulnerabilities that can be exploited for malicious ICT activities. In the Biological Weapons Convention and Chemical Weapons Convention, opportunities and risks associated with advances in AI and machine learning are being implicitly considered in discussions on advances in science and technology of relevance to the conventions. Beyond the UN, to ensure that AI is developed and deployed in a responsible manner and in accordance with legal and ethical values, many governments, regional and international organizations, and civil society members are developing principles and codes of conduct to guide AI development and use in the military domain.
Increasing advances in robotics are transforming many industries, from manufacturing to transportation and warehouse management. Similarly, developments in robotics are changing the way in which wars are fought. Individually, robotic systems provide significant advantages, such as extended range, greater resilience, and more dangerous concepts of operations than possible or acceptable with personnel or manned systems. Collectively, robotic systems may present even more disruptive changes to the conduct of military operations. Swarming as a concept is not new. Swarms can be found first and foremost in nature. Think of flocks of birds or schools of fish foraging or defending against predators. In these swarms, individuals do not need sophisticated knowledge to produce complex collective behaviors, and typically there is no group leader that guides all the other individuals in accomplishing their goal or task. However, swarming is not limited to natural phenomena. It is also a long-standing military tactic that occurs when several units converge to attack a target from multiple axes in a deliberately structured and coordinated way. This type of swarming has occurred throughout military history, ranging from the behavior of horse archers in the 4th century to swarm-like capabilities that simultaneously target multiple vulnerabilities, devices, and access points in the cyberspace.
Swarming is more than just a tactic. Swarming is ultimately a new way of thinking about command and control over military forces. Today, one person controls one robot, but this is a very limiting paradigm for thinking about how to use robots on the battlefield. Swarming allows militaries to move to a new paradigm where one person can control many robots at the same time.
Robotic systems are enabled by the integration of 3 key capabilities. First, sense. Robots need sensors to gather data about the environment. Second, decide. Robots need also to make sense of that data and turn it into purposeful plans and actions. And last, act. The decisions of the robots are extended in the real world through their end effectors and actuators. If we combine the concept of swarms with robotic systems, we have robotic swarms. There are 5 key characteristics of a robotic swarm. The first one is mass. There is no magic number, and in theory, swarms may vary from, as few as a couple of units to thousands of units. While it could be said that quantity has a quality of its own, the optimal size of a swarm will ultimately depend on the swarm's capabilities and the mission it is assigned. The second is diversity. While swarms are regularly portrayed as a large number of exact copies of robotic units, a robotic swarm can be heterogeneous. This means that a robotic swarm can mix simple and more complex robots, or manned and unmanned systems, or it can also be a cross-domain swarm with robots operating in the air, land, and sea. The third characteristic, and possibly the most important one, is collective and collaborative behavior. Now, experts agree that for swarms to be different from simply large numbers of individual robots, they need to exhibit collective behavior that involves collaborating among individual units and with the environment. Considering this, many swarm demonstrations such as Intel's drone light show during the 2018 Winter Olympic Games, may not be considered true swarming if individual robots were simply following their pre-programmed flight paths. To achieve collaborative behavior, some form of communication to allow for information exchange among the robots is necessary. Communication may take different forms and be both explicit or implicit. Particularly in a military environment, explicit communication is vulnerable to attacks, such as spoofing, jamming, or hacking. An implicit form of communication is, for example, the modeling of behavior. Think of sports team, where individual players have a mental model of what the other players on the team will be doing because they're all running the same play. Now, this is not dissimilar to military tactics, where battle drills are used to train teams to execute coordinated maneuvers with limited or no explicit communication among them. The fifth and last characteristic is autonomy and decentralization. While swarms ultimately operate at the direction of human decision makers, it does not mean that humans control the behavior of each individual robot. Instead, they exercise control over the swarm as a whole. For example, a human operator would select which target should be attacked and would authorize the swarm as a whole to engage, while the swarm would coordinate which of its units should carry out the attack according to a list of parameters, for example, proximity or payload.
One of the most significant advantages for militaries will be the ability to use swarms to have military forces that are more adaptable and responsive at the battlefield's edge to adversary behavior.
Today's swarms, in the civilian and military domain, are either under development or still in a testing and demonstration phase. In our report, we have identified 8 military applications currently being researched and developed. For example, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. So swarms may be tasked to search a defined area, for example, to find potential targets. None of the projects we have identified are said to have reached the operational stage. Designing, developing, and testing swarms in structured environments, like a lab, or relatively uncluttered environments, for example in controlled airspace, is only the beginning. Deploying the same technology in an environment that is uncontrolled, unstructured, and potentially hostile presents many more challenges.
Discussions supported by the UN on lethal autonomous weapon systems started in 2014 with informal meetings in the framework of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW, which you covered in the module on conventional weapons. The informal meetings continued until 2016, when the high contracting parties to the CCW decided to establish an open-ended group of governmental experts on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems. This group is often referred to as the GGE on laws and has met annually since 2017. The fact that the GGE on laws is a subsidiary structure within the CCW has practical implications for the work of the group. Each year, the GGE adopts a report by consensus that contains conclusions of the deliberations and recommendations on the mandate for the following year. The GGE report is then submitted to and considered at the annual meeting of high contracting parties to the CCW or the review conference that takes place every 5 years. The budget and the dates of the activities of the GGE are then adopted at the meeting of high contracting parties for the review conference, along with those of other CCW activities. While the focus of the group has evolved over the years, the discussions have mainly addressed technical aspects, international humanitarian law, and military and security concerns. For example, governmental and non-governmental experts have pursued a shared understanding of the core characteristics of lethal autonomous weapon systems. They have also discussed when and how humans must exercise control and judgment to avoid an unlawful or unethical use of a weapon system. Many have also stressed the challenges that laws and related technology may pose to regional and international security, including their potential to provoke arms races and the lowering of the threshold for the use of force. Recently, the group has worked on expanding areas of common understandings around possible obligations for states to commit to, so that certain types of weapons would not be developed or used, while others would be regulated to ensure compliance with international law. Also, a number of states have called on the group to focus more on ethical perspective. In 2019, the high contracting parties to the CCW adopted 11 principles to guide the work of the GGON laws. These guiding principles of the GGON laws reaffirm that international humanitarian law applies fully to all weapon systems, including lethal autonomous weapon systems. The principles also affirm that human responsibility and accountability on decisions on the use of weapon systems cannot be transferred to machines. In addition, the principles call on states to review and determine whether a new weapon should be prohibited by international law. Lastly, the guiding principles of the GGON laws highlight the importance of continued progress in peaceful uses of autonomous technology. As mentioned earlier, the CCW Review Conference is held every 5 years, and 2021 was the year that the 6th Review Conference took place. The 6th Review Conference recognized that a weapon system based on emerging technologies must not be used if it is incapable of being used in accordance with international humanitarian law. The conference also decided that the mandate of the GGON laws is to consider proposals and elaborate possible measures related to the normative and operational framework on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems. In accordance with that mandate, several proposals have been received, which try to capture common understandings and present options for the way forward. The framework set out by the CCW impacts the work of the GGON laws in other ways as well. The CCW's objective of balancing military necessity and humanitarian considerations allow for multidisciplinary discussions at the GGON laws. Also, the CCW's purpose to regulate or prohibit the use of excessively injurious or indiscriminate weapons is in line with the GGON law's strong focus on compliance with international humanitarian law. Furthermore, some texts related to the GG have qualifiers such as in the context of the objectives and purposes of the convention, which refers to the CCW. Since the beginning of the law's discussions, active participation of civil society and academia has been key. Also, the group is to bring in expertise on legal, military, and technological aspects in its deliberations.
In 2022, the group's work is set to take place in 2 meetings in March and July and has a mandate to consider proposals and elaborate by consensus possible measures and options on a normative and operational framework on laws. There are now several proposals on the table, submitted either at the most recent meeting in March as well as from previous years. In the July session, delegations will continue to discuss the proposals and work towards the development and adoption of a document by consensus. Some of the persistent areas of disagreement include, firstly, the nature of the instrument the group's work should produce. There are 2 main approaches here. One is the legally binding instrument, such as an additional protocol to the CCW, or a non-legally binding document, such as manual, code of conduct, or best practices.
Then other contentions in the group's deliberations remain over topics such as technical aspects of autonomy, options and limits of human control over autonomous weapon systems, and lastly, but very importantly, contentions about which branches of international law are applicable, with some groups of states favoring a narrower focus on IHL only, while others support the view that other branches of law, such as international criminal law or international human rights law, should be taken into account as well.
The weaponization of artificial intelligence is a serious danger. And the prospect of machines that have the capacity by themselves to select and destroy targets is creating enormous difficulties, or will create enormous difficulties, to avoid the escalation in conflict and to guarantee that international humanitarian law and human rights law are respected in the battlefields. And for me, there is a message that is very clear. Machines that have the power and the discretion to take human lives are politically unacceptable, are morally repugnant, and should be banned by international law.